I'm your host, Angelina Kelly, and today we are delving into some Premier League finance stories with football finance and legal expert Stefan Borson. So, Stefan, really good to speak to you. Want to delve into some of these football finance stories. Wanted to start with Chelsea because according to these reports, Chelsea have suffered a record loss last season, the highest annual loss ever made by an English football club, the second highest in European history. Despite obviously winning the UEFA Conference League and qualifying for the Champions League, the revenues lagging behind those of their major rivals. For the Blues, how important is securing Champions League again this season for them?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's important. I think none of these clubs. I mean, people talk about it as catastrophic. I think missing out for 1 year is, something that you can mitigate, especially because for a club like Chelsea, the likelihood is that if they were to miss out on the Champions League, they would, in all likelihood, finish in the Europa. And from a revenue perspective, they would probably recover, let's say, a third of the revenue by getting to the latter stages of the Europa. Whereas you might find in the Champions League, similar to this season, it will be a challenge to go beyond, let's say, the round of 16 or the quarter final. So comparing like for like, you're probably looking at something like an 80 million euro hit between the two competitions. And so it's very significant, clearly, but it's something that you can manage for a year. I think part of the issue that Chelsea are going to have is that they appear to be resting quite a lot from a commercial sense on Champions League qualification. They talk a lot, for example, about how important Champions League football is for some of their commercial partners. That may mean really either that they're not capturing the full value of those commercial deals right now because of that uncertainty, or alternatively, that actually they have clauses within those contracts, which means that their revenue would dip in the event that they weren't in the Champions League. There is one sometimes, I mean, it's hard to know with Chelsea, but there is often a mitigation in terms of a lack of Champions League football from wage cuts. So we know certain clubs have got wage cuts if they're not in Europe at all. Certainly Manchester United are in that category. The question is whether Chelsea will be in a situation where the wage bill will reduce substantially if they didn't have any Champions League football. We obviously don't know that from the outside, but that would obviously mitigate this sort of 80 million euro hit, should they not get there. Now, of course, the other factor in terms of Chelsea is that in the next financial year, the one that starts on the 1st of July this year, they clearly won't have any Club World Cup revenue and prize money, which they did have in both the year that's just gone in FY25 and also the year that we're coming to the end of for the current season. Because of the way the Club World Cup works, they would have registered a small segment of the revenue in the FY25, which is the year that we've talked about with the record loss, probably £15 million, £20 million. But the bulk of the Club World Cup revenue and profit will have come in this year. And obviously next year, they won't have anything at all because it's not a Club World Cup year.
Yeah, and when you speak about, the wages and different things like that, there was a UEFA report suggesting that their playing squad is, the most expensively assembled in football history. I don't know if you saw that Todd Bowley had spoken at an event recently where he basically admitted to not knowing much about players and sort of said, if Manchester City wanted Marc Cucurella, then we would buy him. And it hit the headlines. He's basically admitting that he was, almost copying another team's recruitment strategy. But he also spoke about his other investments in mineral resources, defence, as well as sports, and spoke about basically targeting what people want and what people need. And when you look at their transfer policy overall, it seems like Blueco's business strategy of acquiring players who are not just wanted by other teams, but basically trying to have a monopoly on some of the world's young footballing talent is, they're kind of like a one-stop shop for talented players under 25. Is that, in your opinion, realistically working when you factor everything in?
Well, I mean, I thought it was a startling admission in the first
Yes.
place. I don't, I don't see what he was gaining by admitting that certainly in the early days they were quite reckless in the way that they were pursuing actually very big transfers. And what you've got to remember, of course, is that if you buy a player for, let's say in the case of Cucurella, let's say £60 million fee, on top of that you've got probably 10 to 15% of ancillary costs, so agents and um, payments that are made to the players' historic clubs. All of that goes onto the balance sheet and has to be amortized over the period. But then on top of that, you've got wages of probably with Cucurella, let's say for the sake of discussion, £10 million a year. So the whole deal is over £100 million of investment. And they were doing it on the back of, well, what did City want to do in respect of a player? Which, so I mean, it's just remarkable given that obviously the two teams anyway have different needs and requirements, playing styles, different managers, everything else. So it was an amazing admission to start with. Have they, where are Chelsea in terms of this policy around young players? I mean, clearly, on a very kind of base level, if you acquire young players, you've got more chance of them having resale value in the future if they work. Clearly, if you buy Harry Kane at 32, even if he works, the likelihood is that you don't have major resale value. If you buy a player at 22, you've got resale value, but you don't have necessarily the quality or the ability within that group of players to win trophies. Now, they will say, well, we won the conference. Yes, fine, they won the Europa Conference. I don't think that's much of a battle when you've got something like 1.7 billion, as you say, in terms of invested capital within the squad. I think it was 1.7 billion euros that was in that UEFA report. So clearly they won the conference largely because they just had far more experience and value than anybody else, even with a young squad. Club World Cup, I guess, in some ways, is a endorsement of the strategy. I think you could put an argument together there and say actually that was a tournament that some of the biggest clubs in the world were involved in. They won it. Proves young players can win things. But I do think there's a big question mark over whether you can build an entire team of young players. And in any event, even if you do, you've got the issue of resale. So as we understand it from the outside, the policy is all around buy the player young, develop them, and then sell. Well, it would be very surprising if we found out this summer, for example, that they decided that Palmer should now be sold for, whatever. And in any event, who is in a position to be able to buy a player like Cole Palmer, where he's been a major success? So you've got the successful purchases and the successful endorsements of the strategy. And then at the other end, you've got a slightly different problem, which is, let's say, Garnacho as an example, where you may have paid a fee of 40, which, on the face of it is an attractive fee for the player. He's the right age. But then you ask yourself, well, the player's performing very poorly. He's not playing many games. He's on good money. What do you do with that player? How unless you can flip that player on at a profit, how does the strategy work other than effectively keeping you broadly neutral in these signings? Because obviously Garnaccio's book value will amortize over each year of the contract. So if you come to sell him, you don't need to actually make more than 40 to get a profit. You would have a profit anything over sort of, let's say, £32 million. So the point I'm making is young players generally fail more than more experienced players in terms of transfer signings. And yes, they're younger, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you can make a profit when you come to sell them. And at the top end, your players that really work, they're just players you don't want to sell. So I think there's a big question mark over the whole model. I don't think it's been borne out by the numbers. Clearly, the losses. I think the losses are slightly complicated. We can go into that if you want to, but that on the face of it, the losses look horrendous. There are some, there is some small print around that will explain it, and more of that small print will be published by the club as we get into the publishing season for accounts. So they have until the end of March to publish the accounts. Once we've got those, we'll be able to actually see what that 400 million euros comprises of. At the moment, we are guessing.
Yeah, it will be interesting to see. And like you say, there is small print and more will be revealed. I wanted to touch on Tottenham Hotspur because their financial results, I believe, for the 24-25 season are due by the end of March. But of course, everybody is talking about them and what would happen if they face relegation. Humiliation aside, financially, what would it look like? Because, we've got some Spurs players reportedly facing up to 50% wage cuts if they're relegated. There's a lot of talk about if Daniel Levy put relegation clauses into contracts, who would the new manager be realistically? What would happen to season ticket prices, etc.? Is there a world where Spurs could benefit financially from being relegated, or is it just a negative situation across the board for the club?
Yeah, well, I think there's a few facets to it. The first one is that apparently there is a relegation clause in most of the contracts, and it's 50%. Now, clearly, the biggest cost base in any football club is the cost, particularly of the first team, and those wages would reduce. You would not expect the wages of non-football staff to reduce. You would expect those to stay as they are. But the football staff will save them, let's say, something like £100 million, 80 to £100 million on wages. On top of that, you would expect them to sell some of their largest earners, Van der Ven, Romero, probably Madison, etc. So you would expect there to be an outflow of high-earning players and a much reduced wage bill. The question then is, what can they do in terms of revenue coming in? Now, I would say that in a scenario where the team is performing in the Championship, in that theoretical scenario, they would probably maintain most of their match day revenue. I wouldn't think that they would, at this stage, not reduce season tickets. They've already started the process around renewing season tickets, so it'd be very hard for them to unwind it at this stage anyway. So the likelihood is, I think they froze the prices. So I think what would happen is they would say, well, look, we've got 4 more fixtures at home, 8 more fixtures overall. So you're getting more value straight away there because there's more games. And please stick with us because we're going to win the Championship. And sure enough, if they are top of the Championship, playing attractive football, we've seen a number of the bigger clubs do this in the past. Manchester City had a season under Kevin Keegan where they got 100 points and 100 goals, and the stadium was obviously full every week. And you could see that scenario happening at Spurs, where most of the match day revenue effectively was protected. There was more games, so ironically, there actually would be 4 more occasions that they could sell tickets and merchandise and match day refreshments. So there may be a slight boost there as well. So I think they could largely hold match day revenue. TV money collapses. So TV money, just looking at what they received last year when they finished 4th bottom, of course, they got £128 million. So you would see that drop to about 45 probably. So they'd lose about 80 there. But of course, we said before that they probably saved 80 to 100 on the wage bill. So that would sort of net off. And then there's a question over the commercial side of things. Now, I think they've got a problem on the commercial side anyway, because some of the sponsors don't really like 2 years of underperformance on the pitch. I mean, of course, there's still theoretically a possibility that they win the Champions League and have the bizarre situation where they get relegated and are still in the Champions League next season. But putting that unlikely scenario to one side, I think they're going to lose some sponsors. We know that there's a change on the front of shirts. we know that the whole sponsorship market is quite tough actually around the game. It's not just Spurs, but if you to look at Manchester United losing their training kit sponsor, that's a £20 million contract, it seems, from their numbers. That's not been replaced yet. We know Chelsea have got significant issues, as we've seen before, with the front of shirt and with their other partnerships, and that they still don't have a front of shirt for next season. We know that the betting partners are going to have to come off front of shirts across the league. So there's going to be big challenges on the commercial side for Spurs, come what may, whether they're in the Championship or in the Premier League. So I would think you could put, a loss there. Probably, I'm just looking at what they did last year. I mean, Tottenham were doing £277 on the commercial side from the Deloitte. We haven't got the results yet, but we got the Deloitte money analysis. So 277 put them, very high up. I would think that they would could easily lose 70 million quid there. So clearly there's going to be, big elements of loss, probably looking net at sort of 80 to 100 lost revenue. They will try and cut their operating costs. But of course, if you're running events in the stadium, you've still got almost all the costs that you have running the events at the stadium today in the Premier League. That's not really going to change. They are slightly underpinned by some of the non-football revenue that we know about, NFL and some of the, the F1 go-kart thing. It won't be disastrous. Again, it's sort of similar to a lot of these clubs in terms of not qualifying for the Champions League. The problem that Spurs are going to have, when you compare it to this season, of course, is that they're going to go, if it happened, they'll go from a season where they're good chance they're going to get to the quarterfinal of the Champions League. So that's worth probably 100 million quid this season. So that's going to go. And they're going to also lose everything we spoke about earlier. So it will be quite painful. But actually, ironically, this season, the one that we're in now, is actually going to be a very profitable season for them. And so over the 2 years, they'll probably be fairly relaxed about it if they can get themselves straight back up.
Well, I guess that's sort of good news for Spurs fans. They probably won't see it as that, but it's interesting that things will, providing if they did get relegated, they come straight back up. It might not be as bad as some people are thinking. Finally, I just wanted to touch on Aston Villa, because we know that their recent accounts, it marks a third successive year that they've lost money. We know that when it comes to profitability and sustainability rules, their hands are tied to a degree, but they have been impressive this season, especially when you consider those restrictions, injuries that they've had, etc., etc. We know that the Champions League is going to be key for them. Aston Villa fans are very frustrated at the fact that they can't compete financially because of these restrictions set by the Premier League and UEFA. Is it just the rules that are to blame, or are there ways in which the club could be run better?
I think with Villa, I think you can blame the rules. I think, in terms of what they've done themselves, they've operated off a lower wage bill than all of the traditional Big Six. They are touching where Spurs are now in terms of wage bill, so they have sort of squeezed that gap. But that's part of the investment that's come from qualifying for the Champions League last season. I think on the field, clearly they're in a decent position, although the trend is possibly slightly concerning in that they do look like they're going to be in that group battling for Champions League, as opposed to definitely finishing third or even second. So they do seem to have slipped a notch down. So that's going to be a challenge. But the reality is that they've also got this route into the Champions League potentially via the Europa. And, I think given who the manager is and his track record in the Europa League and the UEFA Cup, I think they're reasonably well placed to be able to have a good chance of winning that. And if they did, clearly you get a Champions League place within that mix. So I would say that they've done almost everything right. I mean, with a relatively limited budget compared to, certainly compared to Chelsea, if you look at the gross spend on the squad, it was very disappointing for them to miss out in the way that they did last season on the Champions League, but even to be in that mix again for a second consecutive season, whilst having Champions League football in the mix. So obviously the strain on the squad that goes with that. I think it's an amazing endorsement of the manager in particular, and also the way that he's managed the squad, and therefore the quality of some of the acquisitions. The problem that Villa have got is clearly they're in a settlement period with UEFA in respect of squad cost ratios and also the football earnings test. So that gives them some restrictions. They certainly don't want to breach on the football earnings side, although they may have breached on the squad cost ratio side. But moreover, I think the biggest issue that a team like Aston Villa have got, and it's a similar thing faced by Newcastle, is you've got to be almost perfect from a business perspective. You don't have much room for error. So if they make one or two poor signings, or go through what they're going through right now, injury crisis, or losing 3-4 games in a period, the whole picture can change. You can go from it looking like, well, with a relatively low wage bill, we're going to re-qualify for the Champions League. We're going to get that £100 million prize again for the next season. You go from that to going, actually, we're in quite a lot of trouble here because we're going to miss out on that prize, and we're falling down the league, £3 million a place in the league. Then you've got the problem in that summer of saying, well, actually, do we need to sell a player? So then you go, who's our best player? Where's the most profit? So in terms of the squad, they look at it and go, well, ideally, we'd like to sell Watkins, who I think is 30, or we'd like to sell Martinez, who is probably 32. But the reality is the market for those players is not the same as it is for Morgan Rogers. You don't want to sell Morgan Rogers. It's the sort of Cole Palmer problem we spoke about before, because yes, there's £100 million profit there if you can find a buyer. But of course, you lose a key member of your team. So I think it's quite finely poised. But I would say that Villa in particular are a team that's done almost everything right over the last 3 years.
Well, there you have it, Aston Villa fans. Your club have done okay considering what they are up against. Stefan, thank you so much for joining me. Let us know in the comments your thoughts on those clubs, and remember to make sure that you are subscribed to the talkSPORT YouTube channel for the latest videos on all of those stories.